Yeah.
Hi there, everybody. We're going to get started. I'm Kevin Delaney. I'm representing the Sherburne Historical Society. Welcome to everybody here in the room and to everybody on Zoom. We figured that it's a little chilly tonight, a little rainy. Why not have a fire and just so you can get kind of nice and close if you feel like you need a little bit more warmth. Tonight, the Sherburne Historical Society and the Sherburne Public Library jointly recognized the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution's outset at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. What those patriots set out to create, government of the people, by the people, for the people, took form in an important local manner just this week, when citizens voted to co-fund the new Sherburne History Center. Through the democratic processes the Revolutionary War era wrought, civic discussion, compromise, fundraising, and the ballot box, we achieved our goal of preserving history for past, present, and future Sherburnites. On behalf of the Historical Society, thank you. And after tonight's talk, all of you are invited down to Fireside Tavern for a quick huzzah and glass clinks to further acknowledge this wonderful occasion. Okay, now on to the show. Imagine a dark, cool evening in 18th century Boston. Fog lurking over the harbor, residents scurrying along the sidewalks while a woman empties a slop pail into the street gutter. Nearby, horse hooves clop on the cobblestones while a miasma of stink emanates from all around. An unremarkable Bostonian enters a candlelit public house where he joins a cabal of men, tricorn hats pulled low, who hover over their pints and excitedly whisper about the next effort in what they then call out of doors. Just how much of this heroic mental image is the myth of memory and how much is actuality? Well, one fellow here tonight will help us make that distinction. Malcolm F. Purinton is a food and world historian at Northeastern University whose work focuses primarily on the sociocultural relationships of empire, trade, and technology in the history of beer and brewing. And that, my friends, pretty much makes him my favorite historian. We welcome Professor Purinton, it's a tough one, to share his insights on tavern culture and the coming of the American Revolution. Welcome, Malcolm.
All right, well, thank you very much for having me here. Get this going right to... And there we go. So yes, thank you very much for bringing me in to all the historical societies together. It's also, what a beautiful place. Just driving through here, I'm just like, oh man, it is so green. I mean, it's just so nice. Go from like the mud, the sticks, and then it's just like, boom, you can't even see like 10 feet in front of you with all the green. I love it. So yes, I'm a history professor at Northeastern, and where I teach, history of technology, capitalism, food, all of these wonderful things. But my true love has been really looking at the world through the lens of beer and alcohol, looking at just kind of like social, cultural relationships, the environment, the technology, how all of these things kind of play a role in human societies going back a millennia, many, many millennia. And today, I mean, 250 years, it's been quite a lot of fun, like joining in with all of these Revolution 250 events and like being able to kind of shine a light on where a lot of this revolution was really fomented and what was the role of the tavern. So today, first, I want to kind of bring you into the space of looking at what is a tavern. We have all of these, European colonists coming over here, crossing the Atlantic, and they're bringing a lot of things with them. Not just, their religion, their culture, their languages, their institutions. And a big part of like the taverns, the pubs, that was already part and parcel of the European just life. So, I mean, going back many millennia, where you just have tavern life. I mean, all of like the old masters, like where you can see all of the images of people like in their pubs, sharing pints, sharing draughts of punch, of wine, of beer, all the way through. Where you also have, you don't even need a roof. Honestly, you don't even need a roof. That right there you have a tavern right outside. You know, you got all of the imagery. You have this place of community. You have a place where people could come and imbibe and enjoy. But it shifts quite a bit as you get over to the Americas. There's a shift in what this atmosphere is into what we end up creating right around here. So let's situate ourselves right at the beginning. All right. In Massachusetts. Now, you probably recognize, perhaps this, the Mayflower, right? You know where the Mayflower was going to, it was just seeking for that one rock that would tell them where to stop. Just the image in their head. This is the rock that we need. So the Puritans, right? The Pilgrims, they were not looking for a rock. They weren't trying to get to Massachusetts, right? They were trying to get to the mouth of the Hudson. They were trying to get on the other side of Long Island. But they had a problem. They left late. They had two boats, but suddenly then they only had one. Speedwell, not so good. I mean, the Mayflower itself was not really built. It was not built for humans. It was a sweet ship. It had been transporting wine from Spain to England for decades. It was sweet because it smelled of all of that wine. And so the Pilgrims, as they were coming over, they left a bit late. They were looking for a place where they already had a community, but they couldn't get there because they weren't sailors. They hired this boat. Those sailors had to go back. And how do you get from one place to another? You have to make sure that you have enough victuals. You have food and drink to be able to get across the ocean and get back across the ocean. So those sailors were running out of one very important ingredient of that travel. They were running out of beer. Bradford writes about this, that basically the sailors, they were going to kick them off because they couldn't make it through the shoals, like going around, Cape Cod. And it was already super late. They're like, we need the beer to be able to get back because the water goes bad quite quickly. Like you don't have the understanding of how to deal with water, how to make it safe, the boiling aspect. Beer itself lasts for much longer. Yes, it has alcohol, but not even that much alcohol. It has hops. Hops, wonderful, like nice green flower grows on a vine, but also acts as a preservative, as well as providing aroma and bitterness to balance the sugar from all of the alcohol from the beer. So they didn't quite make it. So they decided, okay, well, we're going to stop here because we kind of have to. The sailors kicked them off the boat, called them like lip gappity goop stockings. They were not very big fans of the Pilgrims, but they just eventually they did share what beer they had left. And it was a very important thing because like they learned shortly thereafter that as they start building more settlements, not just in Plymouth for the Pilgrims, but other different groups, Puritans and so forth, settling in Salem, Charlestown, there's a number of communities. Now, coming from Old Boston, we have the Arabella. Winthrop arrives, the flagship of his fleet. They're bringing thousands of people over here. This is a very well-planned endeavor with the boats they planned on, the boats that were built for people. I mean, lots and lots of people, as well as lots of goods. They learned the mistake of the Mayflower. They knew that they needed enough beer to get across. So they brought 10,000 gallons of beer with them. Now, that's enough for everyone to have 4 pints a day. That is man, woman, and child. Just in case. They made sure, and they knew the importance of water too. They go to Salem, they stop over in Charlestown, they're settling up in Charlestown. They're like, wow, the water here is really terrible. We're gonna go right across the bay. We're gonna go to the peninsula, and now we're gonna found our city on the hill. We're gonna found it because it had very good water, right? So they learned that lesson. So already, just what is beer in this whole situation? We gotta separate ourselves from what we think of with a bar. These are not bars. These are not, people aren't going to the tavern to drink only. Beer itself, I mean, 4 pints per person per day, man, woman, and child, because everyone was drinking beer. Beer wasn't just something that could be intoxicating in larger amounts. It was also food. It was something that provided needed nutrients as well as hydration for everyone. It was part of the daily life. The brewing of beer in the home, the sharing of beer, and then also going to different places. building of taverns. Now, when Winthrop came along, 1630, one of the first things they do is, it is a religious endeavor, right? They are bringing their religion to this space. They are fleeing the persecution. They're trying to get away from the Anglican Church and trying to find a place where they can worship as they would like. So they built a church, a meeting house. One of the first things they do. 1 year later, what's the next thing they build? A tavern. 2 years later, they build a school. So we're looking at the priorities here. The priorities are really right there in which buildings they choose to produce at which time, right away. And just they are bringing the idea of a pub. They're bringing the idea of like, what is beer? And the beer that they were making, this is not very good beer. We're not drinking like a hazy IPA here. We're not like, hey, we're Boston. Let's go visit Treehouse. No, this was dark brown beer, low alcohol. The beer doesn't need to be strong in order to be safe to drink. So you can have beer that is like under 1% alcohol. It's still going to be safer than much of the water. They were coming from really strong like urban areas where there was not very much in terms of sanitation. Like we're still looking at like the era of humors and all these, miasma, bad smell means bad things. And so the water was pretty bad over there. Here, they're like, okay, even Bradford, Winthrop, they're like, listen, do not drink the water. That is for animals. That is an unhealthy alternative. That is not how we hydrate beer, because part of the process of making beer is to boil it. So doesn't matter how strong that beer is. It could be 10%, it could be 1%. It's still safe because it has been boiled. So all of the microorganisms that could make you sick, those are gone. Those are killed. So that's why the beer is so important. It's not distilled. It's not going to be like a rum or anything like that. Wine was very much too hard to gain because it was so expensive. And so here, along with, all of the beer that they brought on the Arabella, within by 1633, they're bringing malting equipment. They are bringing brewing equipment. They are also assigning licenses. So Cole's Inn right here in Boston, just first license for 1633, first licensed tavern. Robert Sedgwick was actually also the very first licensed brewer too. His main home was over in Charlestown. This is like on the peninsula. We've got Washington Street. This will be a bit later, of course. But Cole's Inn is the very first one, that very first license. So they're already kind of creating this controlled environment over who can brew and who can sell. Now, there's a nice Lamb's Tavern right here. You can always tell what a tavern was because you don't have a lot of people being able to read at this point. So he would hold a nice nice big thing, usually a bush perhaps, or some grapes, or a green dragon, things like that, to be able to say like, this is the tavern. Now, what is this space though? It's Cole's Inn. It's not Cole's Tavern, because there's certain terms that we need to recognize right now. It is a tavern, yes, but it is also an inn. It is also an ordinary. All of these things mean the exact same location, or just a place of common entertainment, a place where everyone could gather. Because this isn't, well, generally, these would be very male-dominated spaces, but they could also be run by women. They could also be serving. Who'd be doing most of the brewing? Generally women. Through much of history, most of human history, in the 13,000 years or so of beer production, we're looking at almost entirely being produced by women. So very, very key in producing this specific nice liquid. So look at the importance here too. One of the very first schools, right? We've got Harvard. Now, at Harvard, they actually had their own brewery. Just shows you how important it was. The beer was for hydration. It was part of your breakfast. It was part of your lunch. It was part of your dinner. It was part of the day. Now, in Cambridge, there's a woman named Sister Bradage. She had her own inn, her own ordinary, her own tavern, where a lot of the students, the very young students who are going to train as ministers at Harvard, they like to go there after their classes and pay a penny for their big tankard of beer. Now, those students' parents weren't too psyched about that. They're like, oh, you are wasting all of our money here and all of our investment in you. So they complained to the president of Harvard. So Dunster, President Dunster, he was like, we're actually getting a really good deal here because of Sister Bradage. So, okay, we will make sure they only have 1 penny per visit. That's it. This is how it's going to go. Sister Bradage, please keep going on because this is saving us a lot of money, because people wouldn't be paying necessarily in cash for tuition. They'd be paying also in kind. A lot of these people were farmers. So they'd be paying in wheat, also in barley, the key ingredient in making beer. So he was like, we're saving money. We're not having to produce all of our beer. Sister Radich, you just kind of keep going here. And she did, doing a pretty good job. So all these, young students, generally around 16, 17 years old, we are hundreds of years away from a 21 age limit, because it's also, what is the beer? It is, yes, social lubricant, a space, the tavern, for enjoyment, but also it was a space for the community. Now we have the first meeting house, and then we have the first tavern, one after the other. Typically, in every single town, when it was illegal to live more than about a half mile or 2 miles from a meeting house, you had to have a tavern nearby. And this is a religious life. So on Sundays, you would have a sermon in the morning. You would have a sermon in the afternoon as well. What would you do before, like between those times? Would you go all the way back home? Not likely. You'd go to the tavern. The taverns were almost always set up right next to the meeting house, right next door. Very, very important. Now, for instance, if we look at this image of Lexington, now we've got the Belfry, we've got the Lexington Meeting House, and we also have Buckman Tavern. Now, what does Buckman Tavern have that the Meeting House does not? If we look carefully at these two very distinct buildings, what does one have that the other does not? Bingo. There's no fireplaces in these meeting houses, in these churches. And it can get cold here. It can get very, very cold. If you're going to a sermon twice a day, you got to be able to warm up, both on the inside and on the outside when you're going to these taverns. So it was a necessary place you would have in the center of town. Yes, the meeting house, the purpose of this religious community, right? But you would also make sure there was a tavern, an inn, an ordinary, right next door. Including also, a lot of people who actually own taverns were ministers themselves and control or even deacons in the churches. They would be making sure that these taverns were very close by. One guy, actually, one specific minister, he required that his housing was adjacent to the tavern. Not because he wanted to visit it as often as he could. No, he wanted to make sure he could also observe who was going in and out. Now, you know about the scarlet letter, but you're probably thinking about the A. There was also a D. There was also a very big D, because that was for drunkenness. These were controlled communities. These were small communities. So yes, we can think about the tavern as a place to imbibe, but only to a certain amount. So they set up legislation very quickly, both for who could have licenses. Typically, leading members of the community could actually have a license, but also controlling how much people imbibed. So there would be licensing, there would be fines for the tavern owner as well as those who were drinking too much if there was drunkenness. And it's also in the center of town, where you would also have the stockades, where you'd also have that public humiliation punishment if you were seen drunk or any other type of offense. So all of that was right there. The tavern owners were trying to make some money, sure, but those events, a stockade, an execution, there's gonna be a lot of people there. Sundays, great day for a tavern, because people are going to be going from the meeting house to the tavern, back to the meeting house, all year round. So these are very important places. This is places where the community would gather. This is places where also towns were required to have a tavern, a place of common entertainment. For instance, now they passed a law making it that every single town, once they were established, had to have a tavern, a place of common entertainment, an ordinary, an inn, as soon as possible. Now Concord, well, they waited a little bit too long. In 1660, they actually got fined for not having a tavern. I know, I know I've got a picture of Lexington. I know the rivalry here. I know what I'm saying here. Yeah, so like that once, this was an established part of the community that was necessary, set up by the General Court of Massachusetts, where this is also where court proceedings would happen. You would have elections. Now, you would have the meeting houses. So Old South right here. Again, we don't see any chimneys. We do not see any fireplaces. We see a whole lot of wood, which was not something you really wanted to worry about burning down. And so the tavern would be a central space. Now, a lot of these places in the center of town, there's also where the militia. A big selling day would be Sunday. A big selling day could be when the militia does all of their drills. Leaders of the militias, the Minutemen themselves and so on, well, a lot of them were tavern owners. Some of them would actually even set up drills just so they could get more people coming in. Because you would go in, you'd hang out in the green, in the common, you would run your drills, and then you'd go afterwards and go to the tavern, spend your pennies, and then talk about, the battles that you fought or could have fought and how that drill went for you, and that one great shot that you had with your ball of steel. So it was, and sometimes I would actually be kind of rivals. You'd have like two militias, like this happened over in Rhode Island once, where you have like these two militias, they're all fighting it out, playing like trying to control who's actually on the green. And eventually it gets to a point where one of them flees the field, going to their tavern, closing the door, while the other militia comes up with their bayonets trying to get in. This isn't redcoats and like patriots. These are just colonists, having a day of it into their taverns. So there's actually still marks like of swords like on that wood at that tavern. But if you look at the space too, it's pretty small. So we have Hartwell right here, in Lincoln, in the Minuteman Park. And this is the interior. It is a very small space. Has anyone here been into, say, Warren Tavern or some of the, or like the Golden Bell? Like these are small spaces, low ceilings, because everyone was my height back then. No, it was because it was very hard to keep things warm. You got to keep that down. So, I mean, throughout the winters, like these taverns, they'd be producing all of their own food. They would be having to fill these fireplaces with wood constantly to keep it warm. So smaller spaces, much easier to keep people warm. So people would be stuffed into these nice tavern spaces. And a lot of times, well, you have meetings after church, of course, staying warm, but you have town elections. A lot of times you would not have a courthouse in your town. You would have court meetings happening in the tavern. This is a place of the institutions of the colonies. The tavern was a space that was required by law, a space that was strictly controlled too, over who went in, who went out, how much people would imbibe. It was a space of politics. It was a space of the building of community in these early American colonies. But they were also spaces of different institutions. It wasn't just the religious ones. If we jump into Boston here, we have the Bunch of Grapes Tavern, which would be on, well, King Street at the time, State Street today, at the end of Long Wharf. And it was actually the location of the first Freemasons. 1733 had the first, like the Freemason group, kind of a brotherhood, a fraternity that kind of walked across the bounds of different nationalities. A very powerful organization in its own way, secretive in a lot of ways. Bunch of Grapes actually feted George Washington himself when he announced, this is where he announced that the French were actually going to join in with the American cause. But it was an important spot. Other places, if we look at what was going on in Boston, this licensed taverns, Boston, 1718. Now, still have the peninsula. We've got Long Wharf right there. We've got the North End. We've got Long Wharf. So King Street right there. We've got Beacon Hill over here, going out the peninsula this way. So there's a fair amount. Now, John Adams, not a very big fan of taverns, said that Boston had a tavern like every other house was a tavern, and this is absolutely horrible. Boston had by this point ceased to be just a religious community. It had become a cosmopolitan community that was based on maritime trade. And so a lot of these places, they would be making their own beer, some distilleries happening, but a big thing happened in the middle of the 18th century where one specific type of alcohol became the most popular. One that was tied into the global British Empire, demon rum. This is when those taverns, especially in Boston, those urban taverns, become places of a bit more ill repute. Demon rum, where we also have, so we've got like, the demon right there, pouring out the rum, made with molasses coming from the Caribbean islands, especially Barbados. Part of that triangle trade of enslaved Africans going to the sugar islands, molasses coming up here, being distilled into rum, and then that rum being sent to England, sent back to Africa as well. But rum, as well as hard cider, was extremely important. Now, you've probably all heard of Johnny Appleseed, right? Now, he was not exactly planting, Macintosh. He wasn't exactly planting Pink Lady or, anything like that. He was planting small, hard, knobby apples, crab apples, pretty much. Ones that were pretty, like, not fun to taste. These things are sour. These things are tart. These are not good. Perfect for making hard cider. John Adams, very much kind of against the tavern, would start every morning with a tankard of hard cider. Thomas Jefferson, 2 pints of hard cider every single morning. And we're looking like 8 to 10% alcohol. This is this era between like roughly 1750 up to like 1830. The level of consumption of alcohol kind of goes off the rails. Just a bit. This is why we have in the 19th century all these pushes towards temperance and so on, because of this level. I mean, you have Europeans coming over here, talking about the American colonists as really just kind of a real mess. But hey, a mess that began a revolution, a mess that kind of led through. Now, what happens in Boston is, well, let's look at this. Check out how many we've got. We've got about 35 inn holders, in the lighter dot and like the darker dots. In the lighter dots, we have the retailers. Now, if we go here, it explodes. Most of these are retailers, and nearly all of them are only selling rum. Lots and lots of rum. So by the 18th century, we're seeing different groups emerging. There are actually a number of gangs of Boston, where you have a North End and you have a South End gangs run by, 2 different gang leaders. And in the South End, it would be this guy, Ebenezer McIntosh. And Samuel Adams was really kind of good at pissing people off. He was a real kind of rabble-rouser himself. Now, Samuel Adams was not a brewer. His family were not brewers. They were maltsters. So basically, they dealt with the grain that would then go into the beer. The grain where you would get all of the sugar to then convert that into the alcohol, into the beer itself. And he didn't really he was actually a really poor businessman. Kind of took his family's really wonderful established business and ran it into the ground. But he was focused on other things. He was focused on getting people riled up and keeping the independence that Massachusetts had had for really several hundred years at this, like over 150 years already. They've been left to their own devices until suddenly the British Crown wants to lean on them. So he's recognizing that some of these gangs could be useful because these groups, a lot of them, working in the docks, work on the ropes, all these things. They had one day of the year that the established authorities allowed them to kind of allowed them to go off the rails. Remember, the 5th of November, Guy Fawkes attempts to blow up Parliament, November 5th. Fails, barely. It was pretty close. They had all the gunpowder underneath. But this is a day that was celebrated by a lot of these, Bostonians. Because one of the things, think about how this place was established. Puritans, Pilgrims, religious groups who were very much not Catholic, very much not Anglican. And in fact, they also, the Puritans were so strict that they actually outlawed celebrations of Christmas because of all the wassailing. Like, here we come a wassailing. Yes, this is a lot of drinking, lots of drinking. So Guy Fawkes Day becomes this day for the gangs of Boston to kind of let off all of their steam. It was kind of like a purge. Just like, okay, well, we'll let them kind of go nuts on this. So what would happen is that each side of Boston, you would have both of these gangs, where you would have, in the South End, they're meeting up, at this nice big elm tree, the Liberty Tree. They would meet up, Ebenezer McIntosh and his merry men. They'd create an effigy to the Pope. And they would take this effigy, put it on a cart, and start carrying it, going from the south around here, and then heading up towards the north. The North End gang, they would also have a Pope effigy on a cart that they would be towing to the south. And they would stop at every tavern, inn, retailer along the way to make sure that they were being supported by that tavern, by that group. Now, if you didn't have a circle with an X through it with the Pope right there, and you didn't support them, well, you might see some broken windows. You might see some broken bottles. You might see a little bit of fisticuffs going on. So you got to make sure, because at every single one of these spots, they would get some free booze. generally rum. So things would get riled up and riled up as they're moving, going from the south to the north to the south. They would typically meet up along the canal between Bill Pond and the harbor, and they would go at it. This isn't like dives. This isn't like all West Side Story. This isn't guns. This is all just fists. This is all just kind of like going through and trying to capture the other side's pope. Kind of like I capture the flag, but Catholic style. So what would happen is whoever got their pope, let's say the North End got the South End's pope. Well, they would take that pope effigy up to Cobb's Hill and burn both. Go for it. So now if the South End got the other side's pope, then they would bring it to the Common and burn both there. And Guy Fawkes Day comes to a close. But now Samuel Adams saw, it was already this kind of history of kind of like these type of riots, these types of like kind of acknowledged violence. And Samuel Adams saw this as very useful. He started working with these different groups, especially as we start seeing things like acts and new taxes coming from the crown. Unrepresented, all these colonists being unrepresented in Parliament, taxation without representation. So like, hey, if we can kind of let off some steam, get these gangs kind of moving for us, kind of remove that south versus north side of Boston and try and bring them all together. Maybe this can be a force for a patriotic cause instead, meeting at places like the Liberty Tree. And instead of effigies of the Pope, we can have effigies of the crown. Now, sometimes we would meet at very specific taverns, especially one that was in the middle of the North End. The Green Dragon. Green Dragon Tavern on Union Street. Well, there was a crew, most of them actually Freemasons themselves, Proctor, Revere, a lot of guys, they would, Samuel Adams, they would hang out here. And once the Stamp Act came through, they were very, very unhappy with this. They called themselves the Loyal Nine. But they start trying to kind of, start fomenting a little bit of rebellion. The tavern becomes the center of these discussions. The taverns become the center of planning for different events. Yes, over beer, yes, over some rum perhaps, but it was about the ideas more than anything else. How do you create a country? It's about ideas. How do you foment all of this? Samuel Adams actually was really focused on beer at the Green Dragon. He actually advocated for, we need to stop drinking rum. We need to not import any more wine. You have to make it the local production. Instead of the molasses coming from the British Empire, we should focus on corn whiskey. Instead of being part of this British Empire, let's focus on our own beer. Bring back our October beer, our strong beer, and make that what everyone drinks. Both it would allow for a much less drunk gang coming through, but would also be something that was American made, focusing on that specific piece. Now, the Stamp Act riots, who do you think's really kind of working on those riots? Samuel Adams is really, he's getting the fires going, and he is getting those gangs out there into the street, making sure that, they've already had a pretty good run of understanding what it means to have an effigy being lit up. But now it's going to be, let's move that focus from one that is kind of domestic, one that is interior, but one that is now out, one that can be focused on those redcoats, focused on the crown and Parliament that is not allowing us to speak out. So the Green Dragon, also, they switch from the Loyal Nine, start calling themselves the Sons of Liberty. They start getting Ebenezer McIntosh and his gang. They become, basically like the foot soldiers for these Sons of Liberty. And one of the first things they do, a lot of things were planned at the Green Dragon. One of them was the burning of the ship Caspi down in Narragansett Bay. One of those things that, you may hear about some other large events, but this is one of the first ones. They planned a lot of different things, including, the sacking of the mayor's house, the sacking of everything else. Coming from here, perhaps the most famous, you might know this one. Yep, 251 years ago and a half, we met to plan the consignment of a few shiploads of tea. Now, one of the things, like learning about the history of the American, Revolution, it's always so focused on America, but it's the British Empire that is the enemy in this. They were tied to India. They were tied to Australia. They were tied to Barbados and the Caribbean, to Africa. The British Empire was already a massive part of the world. And this tea, well, they were being forced to basically save the East India Company, to bail them out, because the East India Company was losing money on all of this tea. It was sitting in these warehouses in London. Let's bring them over here. And so the actual goal was to actually just, seize all of that tea. But they'd been hanging out at a tavern for a while as they were getting all dressed up as Mohawks. And well, once they got there, those 342 boxes of tea went straight into the harbor. Oops, it happens. But the British came and, well, they responded rather strongly with a siege, with basically a full occupation of the peninsula, where you have unfortunate events like the Boston Massacre, then highlighted by Paul Revere. But they arrive and suddenly you have a city, a tight peninsula, that now you have a Tory tavern as well as a Patriot tavern. Those are the places where everyone is going to congregate. Now, there's lots of kind of, mixing amongst different groups. This is already a cosmopolitan city. It's part of the maritime empire of the world, big spot. But there's some fears that all of these regulars, these British regulars, might reach out into the countryside. Start hearing that they're going to try and capture all of the gunpowder that is out in these rural areas. So they set up a plan, these Sons of Liberty. And they want to make sure that they can warn everyone off of the peninsula what might happen if those regulars start marching. So Paul Revere got the plan, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, North Church. I love its 250th anniversary thing. I'm not one for like many events, for like thinking about it. I mean, like 249 doesn't really have quite the ring, but like, I mean, this year, like, like being in Lexington, being in Concord, being like through, it's just kind of like, think about exactly 250 years, how much was going on, like right here, right? It's absolutely incredible. And I also love how much the city has actually jumped in on it too, how much everyone has kind of really embodied this moment. So 250 years ago, just about, Paul Revere goes across the Boston Harbor secretively to let them know that the regulars are going to be on a move. It's the middle of the night. It's pretty dark, but they already have a plan. He knows where he needs to go. And in all of these different images representing the ride of Paul Revere, there's a few similarities here. Okay, number one, you have Paul Revere. That's good. He's on a horse. Okay, all of those things. But in every single one, there's a tavern. Because where is he going to go? Where do you go to deliver messages? Where have you already been getting the news of the day? Where have you been going to hear the gossip, hear about the events, both in your town and the town next over, and the world news? Who knows more about everyone else in the community? That's the tavern owner. That's where the news is going to be spread. That is where he's going to stop in every single place on his long midnight ride. Now, on his first stops, he's going to head on up to Medford. And right up there, he's gonna hang out with one of his friends. And he's going to have 2 nice tall glasses of rum on his way. He's going to make his way going by the Monroe Tavern. Going to head up to the Buckman Tavern, where there was a big chest full of very important letters. He's going to hang out with Hancock and everyone at the Hancock Clark House, where they're also going to have some drinks. You know who didn't make it to Concord? Revere. It's liquid courage only gets you so far. Only gets you so far. He gets captured. They let him go, thankfully, but they take his horse, and then he has to walk back to Lexington. Poor man. Poor guy. So, but this is part of the midnight ride. It's stopping at taverns all along the way, making sure that the Minutemen are going to be ready for the regulars as they're coming. Going to make sure that they're going to protect all of the goods and make sure that the British do not gain control over this whole area. Now, I already showed you this one. When he arrives, and they let all the Minutemen know, they ring the bells. That's either going to be, that's not a very good thing. It's going to be a fire most of the time. But this is getting everyone out there. It's like 1 o'clock in the morning. So all Minutemen, they're out there, they got their guns, they've been training for this. This is the militia. They know what's going to happen. Cool. But now they have like 5 hours. So it's like, okay, well, you got to be ready for another minute. All right, you got to wait for the real minute. All right. Thanks for coming out here, but we have another minute. So what are they going to do? Do you think you could go back to sleep knowing the British regulars are on their way? You're already at the Common. Where do you think you're going to go? It's mid-late April. It's kind of cold. Are you going to go hang out in the meeting house? Probably not going to do that now. No, you're going to go a place where it's warm. Make sure you can maintain this courage that you're built up, get that adrenaline going. So they all hang out, they all go to Buckman's Tavern and spend the next several hours keeping themselves awake in the only way they know how. They're going to be imbibing quite a bit. So when you get to that rough, ragged line of Lexington militia, there's probably a reason for that. They're pretty tired, but they'd also been drinking for several hours. Yeah, liquid courage, a big piece of that. So, I mean, I love this because the image also shows you Meeting House, Buckman's Tavern, the whole setup with the belfry right there. Again, ragged line, British regulars. British regulars are pretty tired. I mean, it's like, it's dawn. They've been hiking. They've been like just marching all night, came right around that corner right there. Buckman's Tavern, of course, with smoke coming out of the top. The revolution is beginning. And it is right next to the tavern, showing it is the center of town, showing the major institutions of that town and the roles that both the alcohol, but mostly those taverns, that space holds for this whole moment in time. Now, if you look at here, I love these doodle little, illustrations. So we got conquered. You've got all the British regulars, right? They're all marching toward the North Bridge and the South, like the West Bridge, like trying to control the whole area. Now, Concord had finally, gotten off their butts and created a very nice tavern. And if you look at how this is situated, what is the center of this picture? It is Wright's Tavern. That just before this had been the headquarters for the Patriots, for the militia. Then it became the headquarters for the regulars. And then after that, it became the headquarters. These taverns became hospitals during the Revolution, during wartime. They became the center, the headquarters for generals, for planning, because they were required. This place was also where people would stop. They had to, by law, have enough oats and water for horses. They had to have places for people to stay. They had to have enough food and drink for people who were traveling through. So they had a perfect place to set up in the middle of town. And if you're going to be coming through, you want to talk to the tavern owner as quickly as possible because they know everybody. They likely know who may be against the crown or for the crown. Now, the Golden Ball Tavern, very notable because it was a Tory tavern. So they had actually got attacked by a bunch of patriots in 1774. So the tavern owner is going to know where everybody is. Oh, I saw some suspicious people coming through here. You might want to go check behind this person's house. The tavern becomes a center for all of these pieces during wartime, during the Revolution. Now, the Revolution spread pretty quickly. After the regulars are chased all the way back to Boston, we begin the Siege of Boston. 250 years ago, Siege of Boston is ongoing. What they needed to do, like, how are you going to be able to get the British to leave the peninsula? How are you going to get them to leave? They control the harbor. It's got the world's most powerful navy sitting there in the harbor. You have to be able to target those boats, which means you need cannon. So you have, you've got gunpowder, you've got guns, you don't have the cannon yet. You got to be able to set that up. Those British aren't going to be leaving anymore, but now it's like basically a stalemate. But after hearing about Lexington and Concord, this is crew up in what will become the state of Vermont after it becomes a republic for about 1 year, where you have Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. And they like to hang out in southern Vermont, Bennington, at a place called the Catamount Tavern. And there was already plans afoot for trying to get all of the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, bottom end of Lake Champlain. Benedict Arnold is actually on his way to go meet up with Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys to do just that. But Ethan Allen was known for a number of things. One of them being kind of a real drunk. He liked to drink something called a Stonewall, which is basically like rum and beer and everything else you can think of, like into like one big tankard. Like pretty much all the time. So they were they were like getting all riled up, like, oh man, we're not gonna wait for Benedict Arnold. Again, by that point, he's also kind of like he's not a bad guy yet. He's not a bad guy, not a traitor yet. So they got up, they leave in the middle of the night. They're heading over, trying to find some boats to get themselves across the water to go to Fort Ticonderoga. Benedict Arnold shows up at the Catamount Tavern. They're already left. He's kind of pissed, but he does catch up with them before they actually get into the boats. So about 60 men, they get onto those boats. They go through very, very quietly, somewhat, and they get there and, well, they take over Fort Ticonderoga before it becomes a pencil company. But this is, one of the classic images, and it's a very smooth capture, and they are able to gain all of those cannon. So you're going from the Catamount Tavern to Fort Ticonderoga. That cannon is going to be brought by Knox, Henry Knox. He's going to take it down the waterways, then all the way across Massachusetts. That cannon is going to be set up on all the major high points surrounding Boston, and that is going to be the end of that siege. Now you can threaten all of those boats in the harbor. So the tavern plays a nice little kind of sidekick role in every single one of these major events 250 years ago. Now, George Washington, shortly thereafter, in June, takes over the Continental Army. This is a very romanticized view. This is kind of like a ChatGPT creation of how good this Continental Army looked. He was very unimpressed. Like when he shows up at the Common in Cambridge, people are just kind of hanging out. They're just doing their own thing. There's no nice uniforms. These are all people coming from all around New England to be a part of the army, to be part of the patriotic army. But he knew what was important. He was going to have to train these men, going to have to make them into a standing army, and he had to make sure they had enough of the rations to make sure that they were taken care of, so they would stick around too. So one of the things they would have every single day, Continental Congress, well, you have to have 1 quart of spruce beer or cider per man per day. Now, spruce beer specific, I mean, it's not like they're on a ship, but the spruce actually provides vitamin C, so scurvy, going to prevent that. But beer, cider, also very good, or 9 gallons of molasses per company of 100 men per week. Now, they're not going to be spooning that into their gullets. No, that's to make it into rum. So the role of recognizing what is the most important thing? What is one of those rations that needs to happen for all of these standing army men? Well, it's going to have to make sure that they have their beer, have their rum, have some type of liquid courage as they're going along. And this is actually, this is a picture I took at the Mass Historical Society. So they actually have all these, and you can go check them out yourself. Pretty cool. Now, the roles of tavern, the taverns continue to be very important locations throughout the Revolution. Now, in upstate New York, you have the 76 House. In Tappan, New York, House General Nathaniel Greene. They also like to say that Washington stayed there, but he actually stayed down the road. But there's a lot of Washington slept here. Like the Shirley Eustace House, he didn't do there either. But Fayette did that. Fayette did. Or also one of the more famous ones, still in operation, Fraunces Tavern in New York. Washington, actually, his personal chef was a Fraunces. Yeah, that's who he actually brought up to upstate New York. So Fraunces Tavern becomes the central headquarters, basically, for Washington and for all of the leaders. When they would meet, when the generals would come together in a city, where would they go? They would go to the tavern because it was going to be centrally located. It's going to have enough food and enough drink and enough beds for everybody. It would be the headquarters for all of these. Now in Philadelphia, now we're not quite to that part of the 250 journey yet, but the City Tavern, of course, you're going to have Independence Hall, all those wonderful pictures, everyone hanging out, signing all the declarations and everything. But this is where everyone would go afterwards. You would be going to the tavern. And they hosted, well, everybody. I mean, really everybody. I mean, Samuel Adams when he gets down there, Benjamin Franklin, every single one. And throughout the Revolution, as you get further down and it's ongoing, the tavern is going to play a central role for all of these events. any town, any city, that's going to be that spot where everyone is going to meet, where they are going to plan, where they're going to relax if they can. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Time for questions and discussion. Anybody would like to be recognized in the room? Malcolm, you can handle that, of course. You can look on Zoom too if there's any questions there.
Yes.
Where can one find out about local taverns? For example, in Sherburne, we have no mention of them in the town records before the 18th century. And yet, maybe there were some in the 17th century, but where could one go to find out? Have you any sources?
Archives. So Mass Historical Archives actually has a whole section that's just about taverns. There's actually some really good sources from the late 19th century, as well as from actually the 1970s, written by the National Park Service, Minuteman Park. There's a number of like good primary sources that describe the roles as well as a lot of the locations. You can also look at surveys. Again, that would be going into like town records, but you're not gonna be able to find specifically like just look up tavern. You have to look up all the terms: inn, ordinary, house of entertainment. So if you look at the surveying for the towns for like the ownership, then you can figure out who would have likely owned a tavern. And generally, especially with like more towns, you're gonna find that right there right at the center of town. Figure out what the buildings were around the common, around the green, and one of those will be a tavern. So even if it wasn't called it specifically, also any type of like major road intersection, there would be a tavern. So all of those did exist. Some of them, very few of them do still today. But the best way to do that would be looking at those types of archives. Yes.
Going forward in time, when did taverns kind of not technically fall out of favor, but when did they become less used for this kind of community? And the second, to follow up with that, what do you think is like analogous to a tavern in modern life?
Good questions. So basically, it's soon after the revolution, actually, that the terms become more distinct, where you have tavern and you have hotel. So the term hotel only starts becoming like more popular, like in usage, around 1800. So you're seeing a real clear distinction, because you're also seeing a push. As I said, people were really tying one on for like that whole time period. There's actually a book called literally The Alcoholic Republic, that is a very good like scholarly work all about this. He dives into some serious numbers. But it's that distinction afterwards, because the United States becomes very focused on being like, a secular, like non-religious, nation. And so that's where you start seeing that separation, where the tavern becomes a space that, more equivalent to a bar. And over the course of the early 19th century, that's when we start seeing, like the stronger religious movements as kind of like a backlash towards the levels of an inebriation that were happening, leading into New England being one of the first places to, have prohibition. Like already by like the mid 19th century, you see Maine, you see Vermont already like prohibiting alcohol. And so that Anti-Saloon League, Women's Christian Temperance Union, who actually advocate for beer drinking. They actually do advocate for beer drinking, just because you're looking at that distinction of distilled liquors. Today, tap rooms, breweries, definitely. While there still are some fantastic, looking at Wright's Tavern, but like, it's like a Warren Tavern. I did a talk there at the end of January, and it was on a Tuesday evening, and, had a nice little talk with like the Bunker Hill people, like in the back, but the space is still being used as it was like over 200 years ago. The place was full with locals. Like it's still a space, with the low ceilings and everything. I mean, it's just really cool. Honestly, I totally nerded out about it. But like really, yep.
It's on the second. thing that everybody still goes to. I don't really know of any in America.
I would say the craft beer tap rooms would be the closest equivalent, because they tend to be very, welcoming to families and a lot of them for dogs, where you have food, you got alcohol, it's not too strong, typically serving only beer for the most, like generally. So that'd be the closest equivalent because tap rooms, like for breweries, have become kind of linchpins for towns today. Like a lot of I've going to lots of different beer fests. Like I would say probably like 8 years ago, you would see town selectmen like showing up to try and get breweries to like come to their towns because they bring people. They bring people to the streets. Like they become like a gathering space. For the after work crowd, for the weekends, a place where everyone can kind of gather. And so like, and they tend to be very welcoming to anybody too. So I would say like that would be the closest equivalent today. Yes.
Early on in your presentation, you had said that it was commonplace, I guess, that the taverns provided overnight accommodations,
Mhm.
inns as well as for taverns. And who would be taking advantage of that?
Travelers. That's one of the reasons why it was by law, because you'd have people traveling all over the place. I mean, people weren't like just only in their space. I mean, you'd have, the drovers, people like bring, their sheep and cattle to market. You'd also have, tradesmen moving from one place to another. And so if you didn't have a tavern that was also, an inn, an ordinary, and, I mean, think about that. Just the term ordinary, it really kind of says what it is, because it was so ordinary. But you needed a space for people to sleep, because otherwise, where would they sleep? They'd probably sleep in someone's barn. They'd probably, wake someone up. You don't want someone that you don't know in your very small, close-knit community just staying anywhere. So that was part of it. You need to have a place for people to stay, a place for anyone who's coming through would know that they would have a place. They could get some food, that their horses could be fed and watered, that they could be taken care of. And so that why, early on, it's just town, town, town. But as you start seeing a lot more travel, like the later part of the 17th century and throughout the 18th century, that's when you start seeing these inns, taverns popping up at those major intersections of any roads that would be happening. So it was really a safety factor more than anything. Yes.
Do you come across any information about the businesses distilling the rum? Because there were so many taverns, and I think they were exporting rum.
Oh, yeah.
Big business.
Massive. We're talking like 33 distilleries in Boston alone. Yeah. Oh yeah, mostly for export, but also certain taverns would sometimes like only have a license for certain types of alcohol too. So you'd have like really focused on like beer and wine in one place and cider. Some places, because rum became so popular, they basically only served rum, and they start getting fined for that because rum kind of, I mean, it's demon rum. It starts getting kind of out of hand, but it also becomes like the major export for one of the major exports for the city, being part of the British Empire and part of that triangle trade.
Legislature passed a law banning the use of lead distillery equipment. They sent them to South Carolina, and people down there got the dry grip. And applied in Boston and Charlestown. And
Yep.
They were saying any town could could hire their own inspector, but they designated some inspectors in the city, Boston.
Yeah, it was, I mean, it's pretty much still one of the major cities for all of the Northeast, right, for New England. And so, I mean, Providence was actually producing way more rum than Boston was. Oh man, I mean, massive, massive amounts. Like the Brown family and stuff, they were all involved in that type of thing. But Boston, I mean, that was one of the major exports for Boston. Not too much else. I mean, like they were part of the maritime trade with everything else. Before it was timber, but like when rum really catches on, it catches on big. Because also they're using, like the leftovers from making nice white refined sugar. So it's like, it's a perfect use for that molasses. They can make a lot of money.
You're bringing us back to the 1760s and early 1770s in Boston. You described how Sam Adams and others kind of took advantage, maybe almost, of some existing rivalries amongst kind of working men who had these traditions of stealing each other's boats and so forth. What I'm wondering is, to what extent those men had like the Sons of Liberty or the mob, as they were also called, right? To what extent did those men have agency, political agency on their own? You know, like Ebenezer McIntosh, you referred to, who like led the raid on Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson's house, and it was an outrageous like demolition of his house. Who wasn't actually that bad of a guy.
Yeah.
And they went right after his wine cellar, of course, as part of their, you know, havoc.
Yeah.
Are we just kind of like reimagining them as Sons of Liberty, these heroic men, as opposed to like some of the thugs that maybe they actually were?
One person's terrorist, another person's freedom fighter.
Yeah, is that what you think it is?
So, well, we have to like look at when this was happening. So if we look at, you know, like post Boston Massacre, because like that was already a big mob that had you know, that was already there, and it was until it was really popularized, you know, by Paul Revere, it was a relatively minor event on the big scheme of things. Because if you look at, I mean, the British regulars have been there quite a bit. They had actually, you know, already, you know, partnered with a lot of like the colonists that were here. You have like, it's a cosmopolitan city. So the use of like actual political agency, it was part of their livelihoods would be at a loss if the British regulars take over. So while they wouldn't be actively able to, say, vote in any of these types of meetings or be actively part of the planning, they would still gain a lot of favor as long as, you know, as long as the Patriots do win. So they're also like, they're aligning themselves with their community more so than the ideas. They're aligning themselves with their friends, their neighbors, who would be targeted by the regulars. So they become part of, you know, it's not so much a patriotic idea as much as a protecting your own.
That makes sense. There's one question online, maybe it'll be our last question. Person is asking about whether these taverns also, and I guess when these taverns started to serve as places along the, like, you know, the Boston highways and going down to Hartford and New York and so forth. Presumably that's all part of this too. You know, your focus was mostly on Boston and New England.
Oh yeah, I mean, this is seen throughout. I mean, all of the colonies had laws about having their own taverns and what those taverns would be. So like the term inn would be used more so in the Southeast, while tavern and like place of common entertainment or ordinary would be more popular up here in the Northeast. But all of the different colonies had their own very distinct laws and fines and licenses to make sure they also had a tavern, a place of that people could go, a community space. So for every single one, you know, whether you're talking about the Carolinas or Virginia, they all had their own laws too.
So in some ways, those were like the 18th century motels.
Oh yeah,
The road culture of the 1950s and 60s.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I mean, this we can harken back to like the time of like, you know, the pre-Reformation. All across Europe, all of the centers of towns where you have pilgrimages going down to Rome, they would set up, like monks would generally have monasteries right there where they would be producing beer for sale. Like the Pope would only give them a Gruitrecht, a license, so they could make beer for sale. So that's something going back, you know, hundreds and hundreds of years that kind of transports and becomes and morphs into something much smaller here in the Americas.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. That was wonderful.
My pleasure.
We learned a lot, and you're a great speaker.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, reminder that if you'd like to join us, we're going to be heading over to our own tavern for you know, additional celebration honoring the great week that we had with the new Sherman History Center. So please join us.
Oh, I will. That sounds great.
Good night, folks.